There's a particular kind of quiet that falls over a room when people are trying very hard not to look happy in front of you. I sat in that quiet for almost 20 minutes, watching my family fail at it completely. My name is Iris Calloway, and I was 34 years old the day I learned my parents' entire estate, a business, 3 properties, and a lifetime of savings worth just under $2 million, had been divided in a way that left me with almost nothing while my siblings walked away with almost everything. My mother, Loretta Calloway, had died 6 weeks earlier after a long, brutal fight with pancreatic cancer, and my father, Willis, had passed 18 months before her, his heart finally giving out after a lifetime of stress running the contracting business he'd built from nothing. I was the oldest of 3 children, and for most of my life, I'd believed, foolishly, that being the oldest meant something in a family like mine. I learned exactly how wrong I was, sitting in a conference room across from my parents' longtime attorney, a stiff, formal man named Gerald Voss, listening to him read a will that gave my younger brother, Marcus, the contracting business in its entirety. My younger sister, Bethany, received 2 of the 3 properties outright. And me, the daughter who'd moved back home for the final 14 months of my mother's illness, who'd quit my job to manage her medications and drive her to chemotherapy and sleep on a cot beside her hospital bed during the worst of it, received $20,000 and a modest life insurance policy. $20,000. Out of nearly $2 million. I sat perfectly still while Gerald read those numbers aloud, watching Marcus's jaw tighten with barely contained excitement, watching Bethany's hand fly to her mouth in a gesture that looked almost like genuine surprise. Though something about the timing of it felt rehearsed even then, something I wouldn't fully understand until much later. Nobody looked at me. Nobody said a single word of comfort or acknowledgement as the reading concluded, as though the 14 months I'd spent draining my own savings, sacrificing my career, watching my mother slowly disappear in a hospital bed I'd slept beside more nights than I could count, simply hadn't happened at all. I walked out of that conference room in a daze, and by the time I reached my car, my phone was already buzzing with a group text from Bethany, planning a celebratory family dinner for that weekend. A celebration. 2 days after burying my mother's ashes, my family was celebrating. I had no idea that 48 hours later, everything I thought I understood about that will was about to change completely. I need you to understand the shape of my family before I can explain what happened next, because none of this makes sense without the years of context underneath it. My mother had always been complicated in her love, generous in some ways and strangely withholding in others, a woman shaped by her own difficult upbringing into someone who equated usefulness with worth. Marcus, the only son, had always been treated with a particular reverence in our household, the assumed heir to my father's business from the moment he was old enough to hold a tool. Bethany, the youngest, had inherited my mother's charm and her ability to make herself the emotional center of any room she entered, a skill that had served her well throughout our childhood and, apparently, straight through to the reading of a will that favored her substantially. I had always been the responsible one, the one who showed up, the one who absorbed whatever needed absorbing so the rest of the family's peace could remain undisturbed. I'd told myself for years that this role, while exhausting, was also a kind of quiet honor, proof that I was trusted, needed, valued in ways my siblings weren't. I understand now how thoroughly I'd convinced myself of something that was never entirely true. When my mother's diagnosis came 14 months before her death, it was me who quit my marketing job without hesitation, me who moved back into my childhood bedroom, me who learned to manage a complicated medication schedule and communicate with a rotating cast of oncologists and hospice workers while my siblings visited occasionally, briefly, always with some reasonable excuse for why they couldn't do more. "You're just better at this kind of thing," Bethany told me once, maybe 4 months into my mother's illness, when I'd asked, gently, if she could take a weekend shift so I could sleep in my own bed for 2 nights. I'd just get too emotional. "You're stronger than me, Iris. Mom needs that right now." I believed her. God help me, I believed almost everything my family told me about myself for years, right up until Gerald Voss read that will aloud and I understood, with sudden, devastating clarity, exactly how little all of that sacrifice had actually meant to them. My mother had been lucid, mostly, until the final 10 days of her life. She'd had ample time to update her will if she'd wanted to reflect the reality of who had actually shown up for her. She hadn't. Or so I believed, sitting in stunned silence in that conference room, watching my siblings barely contain their relief. I had no idea my mother's final act had nothing to do with that will at all. Are you enjoying the story? Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. If you're enjoying it so far, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Because believe me, this story is only getting started. Now, let's get back into it. The celebratory dinner Bethany planned happened exactly as scheduled, 2 days after the will reading, and I want to be honest that I almost didn't go. I sat in my car outside my childhood home for nearly 15 minutes before finally forcing myself inside, drawn by some exhausted, masochistic curiosity to see exactly how my family would behave now that the money had been settled and there was, presumably, nothing left to perform gratitude for. I wasn't disappointed in my low expectations. Marcus arrived already discussing expansion plans for the contracting business, practically giddy with possibility. Bethany had brought champagne, actual champagne, to a dinner meant to follow the reading of our mother's will, and poured herself a generous glass before the appetizers had even finished being served. To new beginnings, she said, raising her glass, and I watched, with something like out-of-body detachment, as our Aunt Delphine and a handful of cousins raised their glasses along with her, apparently unbothered by the fact that our mother's ashes had been interred less than 2 weeks earlier. Nobody raised a glass to me. Nobody acknowledged, even briefly, the 14 months I'd spent hollowing myself out beside a hospital bed while the rest of them lived their lives largely undisturbed. I sat through that dinner mostly in silence, picking at food I couldn't taste, watching my family celebrate an inheritance built partly on labor I'd provided for free, and somewhere around the second course, I finally understood something I'd been avoiding for months. They had never actually seen me as family in the way I'd always assumed. They had seen me as useful. And usefulness, once it stops being necessary, apparently doesn't earn you a seat at the celebration. I left before dessert, citing exhaustion, which wasn't entirely a lie. Marcus barely looked up from his conversation with our uncle about business projections. Bethany hugged me at the door, quick and distracted, already turning back toward the party before I'd even reached my car. I drove home that night with tears finally, fully falling, not the careful, controlled grief I'd allowed myself throughout my mother's illness, but something rawer, angrier, grief tangled up hopelessly with a betrayal I was only beginning to understand the full shape of. I had no idea, pulling into my driveway that night, that my phone would ring the following morning with a call that would unravel everything I thought I knew about that will, about my mother's final wishes, and about exactly how much she'd actually seen during those final 14 months I spent by her side. Gerald Voss called at 9 the next morning, his voice carrying an unusual note of formality even beyond his typically stiff demeanor. "Miss Calloway," he said, "I need you to come to my office this afternoon. Alone, if possible. There's a matter regarding your mother's estate that requires your immediate attention." My stomach dropped, old instincts flaring to life, some part of me instantly bracing for more bad news, some further diminishment I hadn't yet been informed of. "Is there a problem with the will?" Gerald was quiet for a moment, choosing his words with obvious care. "Not exactly a problem. I'd prefer to explain in person." I arrived at his office that afternoon in a state of anxious confusion, unsure what to expect, my mind cycling through increasingly unlikely scenarios during the entire drive. Gerald greeted me with a formality that felt almost ceremonial, gesturing for me to sit across from his desk before retrieving something from a locked drawer, a plain white envelope, my name written across the front in my mother's unmistakable handwriting. The letters slightly shaky in a way that told me it had been written during a period when her strength was already failing. "Your mother came to my office alone 11 days before her death," Gerald said, sliding the envelope across the desk toward me. "She was lucid, fully aware of what she was doing, and I want to be clear about that before you open this. She specifically instructed me to hold this envelope and deliver it to you exactly 2 days after the reading of her will. Not before. She was very precise about the timing. My hands trembled slightly as I picked up the envelope, my mother's handwriting blurring slightly through sudden tears. Why 2 days after? She didn't fully explain her reasoning to me, Gerald admitted. She simply said she needed you to see something first, before you opened this. I believe, based on our conversation, she meant for you to witness exactly how your siblings would behave once they believed the matter was settled. I sat in stunned silence, understanding slowly dawning, cold and clarifying, as I turned that envelope over in my hands. My mother, in her final lucid days, had apparently anticipated the celebration, the champagne, the complete absence of acknowledgement for everything I'd sacrificed. She had planned for this moment specifically, deliberately, with a precision that suggested she'd understood my family far more clearly than I'd ever given her credit for. Do you know what's inside? I asked Gerald, my voice barely steady. I do, he said quietly. And Miss Calloway, I think you should sit down properly before you open it. I was already sitting. I gripped the arms of my chair anyway, bracing myself for whatever truth my mother had waited until this exact moment to finally reveal. I opened that envelope with hands that wouldn't fully stop shaking, and inside, I found 2 things: a handwritten letter in my mother's increasingly frail script, and a second, smaller document that Gerald explained, quietly, was a separate legal instrument entirely, one that existed completely outside the will Marcus and Bethany had celebrated 2 days earlier. I read the letter first. My darling Iris. If you're reading this, it means the will has been read, and I imagine, knowing your brother and sister as well as I do, that some kind of celebration has already happened. One that made you feel exactly as invisible as I'm afraid I allowed you to feel for most of your life. I need to tell you something I should have told you while I still had the strength to say it aloud instead of hiding behind this letter. I saw everything you sacrificed these past 14 months, Iris. Every night you slept in that uncomfortable chair beside my hospital bed. Every appointment you rearranged your entire life around. Every time your brother and sister found some reasonable excuse to be elsewhere while you stayed, exhausted and quietly resentful, doing the work none of them wanted to do. I let the will stay the way your father originally structured it years ago, favoring Marcus and Bethany the way he always favored them, because I needed to see something first. I needed to see whether love, real love, actually motivated the 2 of them, or whether they'd simply been waiting their entire lives for a payout they believed they were owed. I am so sorry it took your suffering and my own dishonesty to finally give me that clarity. That was wrong of me, and I own that failure completely. What you're about to read in the attached document is something I built quietly over the final months of my illness, separate from the will entirely, funded through accounts your father never knew existed, built specifically, deliberately, for you. Not because you deserve payment for loving your mother. Because you deserve to finally understand that I saw you, completely, even when I failed to say so while I still could. I love you more than I ever managed to show you properly. I hope this finally says what I couldn't. Mom. I sat in Gerald's office with tears streaming freely down my face, the letter trembling in my hands, and reached, finally, for the second document, understanding with sudden, breathless clarity that whatever it contained was about to change absolutely everything. The second document was a trust, established 4 months before my mother's death, funded through a private investment account she'd built quietly over nearly 2 decades, one that had never been touched by my father's business, never factored into the estate Marcus and Bethany believed they'd fully accounted for. Your mother began building this account 31 years ago, Gerald explained gently, watching me absorb the numbers on the page in front of me, shortly after you were born. She made small, consistent contributions over decades, entirely separate from household finances, entirely unknown to your father or your siblings. It grew, over time, into something considerably larger than either of us initially expected. The trust was valued, according to the documents in front of me, at just over $3 million. $3 million. Structured entirely in my name, established as a separate legal entity outside the will, completely untouchable by any contest my siblings might attempt to bring against it. I don't understand, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Why did she build this so quietly? Why not just include it properly in the will? Gerald was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. Your mother told me, during our final meeting, that she wanted this money to exist as something entirely separate from the family dynamics she'd allowed to fester for decades. She said, and I remember this clearly, that she wanted you to have something that had never been touched by anyone else's expectations or resentments. Something built purely, quietly, out of love, without a single string attached to your siblings' approval or awareness. I thought about 31 years of quiet contributions, thought about my mother, patient and deliberate, building something entirely for me across decades while simultaneously allowing the visible, obvious inheritance to favor Marcus and Bethany the way my father always intended. I thought about that hospital room, about the nights I'd spent exhausted in an uncomfortable chair beside her bed, never once suspecting she'd been planning this specific reveal, this specific timing. Watching me quietly to see exactly how my family would treat me once they believed the matter of inheritance was fully settled. She wanted to see how they'd act, I said slowly, understanding fully landing at last. She wanted to know if they'd finally show me some acknowledgement, some gratitude, once there was nothing left for them to perform it for. I believe so, Gerald said quietly. And Ms. Calloway, I think we both know how that test concluded. I sat in that office for a long time after signing the necessary paperwork, holding my mother's letter against my chest, feeling grief and vindication tangled together in a way I hadn't expected, wasn't entirely prepared for. I had no idea yet how Marcus and Bethany would react once they learned exactly what had been happening, quietly, for 31 years, right under their noses. I didn't tell Marcus and Bethany immediately. I want to be honest about that, because I spent almost 2 weeks sitting with the knowledge privately, needing time to fully absorb what my mother's final act actually meant before I was ready to navigate my siblings' reactions to it. During those 2 weeks, I finally allowed myself to properly grieve, without the added weight of humiliation and betrayal tangled into every memory of my mother's final months. I read her letter dozens of times, understanding new layers of meaning with each reading, understanding finally that her quiet, complicated love had actually been paying closer attention than I'd ever given her credit for. I also, during those 2 weeks, finally quit performing usefulness for a family that had shown me exactly how little that usefulness meant to them once I stopped providing it. Marcus called first, eventually, having apparently heard through Aunt Delphine that I'd been acting strange since the will reading, some rumor circulating that I'd been seen at Gerald Voss's office more than once. What's going on? Marcus asked, his tone carrying the particular impatience of someone who'd never had to work especially hard for anything in his life. Delphine says you've been meeting with the lawyer again. Is there a problem with the will? There's no problem with the will, I said honestly. The will is exactly what it was when Gerald read it to us. Then what's going on? I considered, for a moment, simply telling him everything, letting the full weight of my mother's carefully orchestrated reveal land exactly where it needed to. Instead, I found myself wanting to see something first, an instinct I recognized, with sudden clarity, as an echo of exactly what my mother had done to me. I'll tell you and Bethany together, I said. Family dinner this weekend. My place this time. Marcus agreed, curiosity clearly overriding whatever mild irritation he felt about the change in venue. Bethany called an hour later, equally curious, equally unable to fully hide the assumption underneath her questions that whatever I needed to discuss must somehow benefit her further. I spent that week preparing, not for confrontation exactly, but for clarity, for finally saying aloud everything I'd swallowed for years in service of being the responsible one, the reliable one, the daughter who showed up without ever being properly seen for it. I had no idea, setting the table for that Saturday dinner, exactly how thoroughly the coming conversation would reshape my relationship with both of my siblings, in ways neither better nor worse than I expected, but entirely, permanently different. Marcus and Bethany arrived together that Saturday evening, curiosity written plainly across both their faces, settling into chairs around my small dining table with the same casual expectation I'd watched them carry through decades of family dynamics that had always, somehow, centered their needs above mine. I served dinner first, deliberately unhurried, watching them exchange increasingly impatient glances as I discussed ordinary things, work, weather, anything except the actual reason I'd asked them there. Iris, Bethany finally said, setting down her fork with visible frustration, you said you had something important to tell us. Can we please get to it? I set down my own fork carefully, gathering the composure I'd been building for 2 full weeks. Mom left a letter, I said. And a trust. Separate from the will entirely. She set it up quietly, over 31 years, without either of you knowing, without Dad knowing. She had Gerald deliver it to me specifically 2 days after the will was read, because she wanted to see how you'd both behave once you thought the inheritance was fully settled. The silence that followed was almost identical to the silence in Gerald's office, except now I was the one watching realization dawn across 2 faces instead of experiencing it myself. What kind of trust? Marcus asked slowly, his earlier impatience replaced by something sharper, more calculating. $3 million, I said simply. Entirely mine. Entirely separate from anything either of you inherited. Bethany's face went through several rapid expressions, shock, then something that looked uncomfortably like envy, before finally settling into a carefully composed neutrality. That's incredible, Iris. I'm happy for you. The delay before that sentiment, the visible effort it took her to produce it, told me everything I needed to know about how genuine it actually was. She wanted to see if either of you would finally acknowledge what I sacrificed these past 14 months, I continued, keeping my voice steady, once you believed there was nothing left to gain by acknowledging it. I think we all know how that test concluded. Champagne. A celebration. Not a single word of thanks for me, not even a moment's acknowledgement of what those 14 months actually cost me. Marcus's jaw tightened, old defensiveness rising fast. That's not fair, Iris. We were grieving too. You were grieving, I said quietly, and celebrating in the same breath, 2 days after Mom's ashes were interred. I watched you do both those things simultaneously, Marcus. I don't need you to explain that away. The table fell into another long silence, heavier this time, thick with truths none of us had ever spoken quite so directly. I had no idea whether this conversation would ultimately repair anything between us or simply confirm, permanently, exactly how far apart we'd always actually been. So what happens now? Bethany asked eventually, her voice smaller than I'd heard it in years, some of her usual careful composure finally cracking under the weight of the evening. Now, I said slowly, I think we all have some things to sit with. I'm not interested in punishing either of you further, if that's what you're worried about. The trust is mine, legally and completely, and I have no intention of sharing it or discussing terms of any kind. That's not why I told you tonight. Then why did you tell us? Marcus asked, still visibly working through his own complicated reaction. Because I'm tired of swallowing things, I said honestly. I swallowed feeling invisible my entire childhood because I told myself being the responsible one was its own kind of honor. I swallowed feeling used during Mom's illness because I told myself family means showing up regardless of whether anyone notices. I'm not swallowing this. I wanted you both to understand, clearly, exactly how Mom saw what happened these past 2 years, even when neither of you seemed to notice it happening at all. Bethany's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time all evening, they looked entirely unrehearsed. I didn't realize how much you'd actually given up. I told myself you were just better at handling that kind of thing, easier for you somehow. I never really let myself think about what it was actually costing you. I know, I said, and I meant it without cruelty, understanding finally that some of my family's blindness had been convenient rather than deliberately cruel, though the effect on me had felt identical either way. That's exactly the problem, Bethany. None of you ever let yourselves think about it. Marcus was quieter, less immediately emotional, but something in his expression had shifted slightly by the end of that evening, a first small crack in decades of assumed entitlement. I don't know how to fix this, he admitted finally. I don't think one dinner undoes years of not seeing something clearly. No, I agreed. It doesn't. But it's a start if you both actually want one. We didn't resolve everything that night. I want to be honest about that, because tidy, complete reconciliation makes for a better story than the messier, more gradual repair that actually unfolded over the following months. But something had shifted in that dining room, some old pattern finally interrupted by truth spoken plainly instead of swallowed quietly the way I'd swallowed everything for most of my life. I had no idea, watching Marcus and Bethany leave that evening, exactly how much slower and more honest the following months of rebuilding would actually be. It's been 18 months now since my mother's letter finally gave me the acknowledgement she'd never fully managed to offer while she was still alive to say it aloud. I used the trust carefully, deliberately, starting my own marketing consultancy that had always existed as a distant dream during the years I'd spent absorbing everyone else's expectations instead of building my own. The business has grown steadily, built on the same quiet, patient foundation my mother apparently modeled for 31 years without my ever fully understanding what she was doing. My relationship with Marcus and Bethany is different now, not perfect, not fully healed, but built on more honest footing than it ever managed during the decades before that reading of the will. We have dinner monthly, the three of us, conversations slower and more careful than they used to be, both of them making visible, deliberate effort to actually see me in ways they never quite managed while our mother was alive to unconsciously encourage the old, familiar patterns. Marcus, surprisingly, has become the sibling I talk to most honestly now, something neither of us expected given how sharply that first post-inheritance dinner unfolded. Bethany still struggles sometimes with old instincts, old assumptions about whose needs deserve center stage, but she catches herself now, more often than she used to, correcting course in ways that feel genuinely earned rather than performed for an audience. I visit my mother's grave regularly, the same patient, quiet ritual I once maintained beside her hospital bed, except now I bring her updates instead of medications, tell her about the business, about the slow, careful rebuilding happening between her 3 children in the aftermath of her final, complicated gift. I understand her better now than I did during those 14 months I spent caring for her, understand the specific, painful shape of a woman who loved deeply but expressed it imperfectly, who needed to witness her children's true characters before she could finally, fully, acknowledge the daughter who'd shown up every single day without ever properly being thanked for it. People ask me sometimes what I learned from that envelope, from the letter, from 31 years of quiet contributions building toward a moment my mother orchestrated with a precision I'm still, honestly, in awe of. I tell them the truth. Sometimes the people who love us most imperfectly are still capable of seeing us most completely, even when their timing, their methods, their entire approach to expressing that love arrives wrapped in complications we never asked for and don't always fully understand. My mother gave me the smallest portion of everything she and my father built together. She also gave me proof, undeniable and permanent, that she'd seen exactly who I was, all along, even when I doubted it most. The end.